wanted to add a few more things actually to just mention a few things about the quadrant model, then hopefully we get back to Freud and stuff about that. So we have, I just wanted to mention another thing about the idealists, the NFs. They're very imaginative. Like I said, they sense things really well. They have good awareness of things. They're very into mystical things, but they say that things cannot, they're very into saying things cannot be said in words and things cannot be known. There's a paradox involved in this. They say that things can't be known, but then they claim that they know that things cannot be known. That's a paradox. I think that things can be known. I think that things are known. But just another thing I want to say is that NFs are just very imaginative. They have a lot of great ideas. They're inspiring. They write these books that inspire people. Artistic in a lot of ways in that aspect. Very articulate. Now, one thing I want to say about Richard Feynman, who was an ENTP, he said that he has a lot of imagination as well. He's also intuitive. But he says that he has imagination in a straitjacket. So he claims that he also has a lot of imagination, he has a lot of good ideas, but he keeps his ideas in reality. And he's able to articulate them in a way that is useful more. Whereas, I know that idealists, like I said, first quadrant is science. Idealists love science fiction. They tend to like science fiction more than regular science or regular philosophy, they like imaginative things more than things in reality. Feynman, he came up with quantum chromodynamics. Seems complicated. Everything is just the form, though. But smart guy. But like I said, he keeps imagination in a straitjacket. He said that once, some guy was talking to him about anti-gravity machines and all these crazy things, and Feynman has to keep the people grounded. He says what's possible, what's not possible, what's real, what's not real. He can differentiate. A thing I want to say about artisans. Remember, artisans are thinkers, emotional, doing, dreaming. This is rational, interpersonal, egocentric. I forgot to mention that emotion and dreaming and doing and thinking, these are all central to what is learning. They're all very important for learning. So people have studied if the emotional part of the brain doesn't work right, then learning things is very difficult. Emotion is very important for learning. Dreams are very important for learning. Remember, this is the rational, interpersonal quadrant. Learning is important for this one. Here's something interesting too. If you just think about exercising, so if I think about lifting weights for an hour, it really is the equivalent of lifting weights. I saw this on a BBC episode. It really is the equivalence of lifting weights for about a half an hour. Because just by thinking of lifting weights, your muscles are working the same way that they would if you were lifting weights. So once again, is there much of a difference between thinking and doing? These are all very interconnected. Okay. Oh, another thing I want to say is that NFs, I talked to a lot of NFs, and they have a lot of very interesting ideas about disease. Remember, they're healers and stuff, and a lot of the ideas are right, but they tend to blame the victim a lot. So I was talking to NFs, some NFs, and they were saying, and you see these self-help books written by NFs that say the same types of things. They say if your thoughts are right, if you're in a good state, if you're in a good state where your energy, they say things like, quote unquote, energy is not being blocked and stuff, then you won't get cancer and you don't get sick and all these things. So they kind of blame, so if someone gets cancer, then they will say stuff like, yeah, well, probably because, he wasn't, his thoughts were in the wrong place, or his energy flow was clogged up due to his thinking processes that weren't working right. So they tend to blame the victim a lot. I think that this is a quality that this first and second quadrant have of blaming the victim because they're more conservative. So think about it this way. if there is, let's say that there's a lot of black people in America that don't have, that have poor socioeconomic circumstances. Well, a great way to justify this is to say, well, it's because their thoughts aren't in the right place. I saw this on the Netflix show The Secret, where they say, you know, where you're at in life, it all has to do with your thoughts. So what they do is they say, if you're rich, it's because you're thinking right. If you're if you're poor, it's because your thoughts are in the wrong place. This is a great way to blame the victim. It's a great way to maintain the social order. Remember, I also said that guardians tend to be religious. They're the belief, faith, behavior, belonging quadrant. So think about it this way. I've noticed that a lot of times religious people tend to be racist, who tend to be SJ oriented. And I think the reason for that is they see everything as being due to, you know, that everything is due to God's plan. God just makes it the way that it is. So if people are suffering, it's because, you know, they deserve it. They may not believe in God enough. Or I have an example of this. I was sitting in a group of just dropped my pen. Sitting with a group of or black people. We were studying the Bible, and one of the girls brought up the passage of where King David says that he has never seen anybody poor who believed in God, something along these lines. Anybody impoverished who believed in God. And I questioned, I said, do you guys really believe that that's true? And then the girl said, well, of course it's true. It says so in the Bible. I said, well, I didn't say this, but one thing I do want to say is King David is a character in the story of the Bible. And everything that King David says doesn't necessarily have to be true. And what King David says in the Bible, a lot of times he is deceitful. He's manipulative. You're not supposed to trust everything that King David says. And it makes sense that a king would say something like that in order to maintain the order, the social order. Say, to blame the victims who are poor, it must be because they don't believe in God. But David wasn't an idiot. David was David was a great character in the story. But yeah, so then the girl said, well, of course it's true. It says so in the Bible. I said, well, you know, you can't really trust what's in the Bible and stuff. So then I asked, though, well, look at Africa. You see a lot of people. It doesn't really matter either way. But I said that there's a lot of people who are impoverished, who are starving. Do you think it's because they don't believe in God? And she said that she thought that was so. I said that, well, there's probably a lot of Christians there too who believe in God who are also impoverished. And there's Christians in America who are impoverished, who are suffering. And she said, well, they must not really believe in God. They must just be faking it. So it's kind of interesting. So you see how this quadrant is very conservative, and it's good for maintaining the social order. Blame the victim. Maintain the order. Okay. So we were talking about, I forgot to mention a few things too. I forgot to mention Punnett Squares in biology, Mendelian biology. Punnett Squares are basically just quadrants where you have two genes. Here's the dominant, the recessive, dominant, recessive, or dominant, recessive, and then you have, you know, D, D, and then two little d's. So the idea is, this would be the mother flower, and this is the male flower, the female flower. They mix their genes. This is the classic Punnett square, and then you have two big D's. This is dominant, so it would be purple. A D represents purple, a small d represents green. Here's a big D and a little d. it's purple because the dominant one is the big D and it overrides the little d. So a flower with these genes will still be purple. Same thing with this one, still be purple. But if you get the two small d's, then you get a green. You get a green flower. I'm just making this up with the colors, but so once again we have the three that are the same, the fourth which is different. This is the classic Punnett square. So we have the three purple and then the green, and then of course this, maybe then this flower is going to mate with this flower, and then you have another Punnett square, and it goes on and on. So this is another quadrant example, but everything is the quadrant. Another thing is game theory is also used in biology. Game theory is about decision making. Remember, biology is a third quadrant science, and third quadrant is about survival, survival of the fittest, fighting, the ego based, right? Well, that makes sense. So when people say, oh yeah, no, Darwinism isn't true, it actually is true. The third quadrant, biology, is about, fighting for survival, the ego. There really is this struggle for survival in nature, and genetics is important in this struggle. So, but in game theory, what they call the atomic game, you'll have two characters. There's cooperate, defect, and there's the different possibilities that one player cooperates, the other player cooperates. You have this possibility. You have one cooperates, one defects. You have this possibility, you have this possibility, and you have this possibility. And then with these different possibilities, you have different outcomes. And so basically, this is how game theory works. If you see the movie about Nash equilibriums, with I forget the guy's name. His name was Nash, but you'll see stuff about the Nash equilibrium, which is based on the quadrant. This is the atomic game in game theory. Von Neumann has other stuff. Came up with other stuff too. But so then this is how game theory works. Basically, it works around the quadrant. Well, I wanted to say we were talking about Freud's phallic stage. About he says that there's the Oedipal Complex starts to take stage. What the Oedipal Complex means is that the son starts to try to have, he starts to want to have sex with his mother. Now, this actually makes sense, though, in terms of biology as well. So please hear me out. This is the way that it works. According to genetics, what you want is you want your genes, most of your genes, to be spread to the next generation. So who has the genes closest to your genes is your mother. So if you did have sex with your mother, then most of your genes, more of your genes would be brought to the next generation if she had a child. But we know that if too many genes are the same, there's more of a likelihood of mutations and genes that are, genes going together that aren't good. So it's not good to have too many genes that are the same. So, so if you ended up doing that, then your child probably, is more likely to die and not be healthy, even though you're having a lot of your genes spread to the next generation. So it's not a successful strategy to have sex with your mom and have a child with your mom. It doesn't work very well. So instead, this is what biologists have found. I watched it on a BBC episode, and what they were saying is that they've done a lot of studies in biological studies where they test to see. And I'm not going to get into the details about how they do this, but it's true. They test to see what type of people men and women are attracted to and what type of people they end up marrying. It turns out that men are more attracted to women that look more like their mothers. And women are more attracted to men who look more like their fathers. So if you think about it that way, this is a strategy to keep your genes going, because if you have sex with someone that looks like your mother, then perhaps you're thinking, subconsciously, this person has similar genes to my mother, has similar genes to me. If I have sex with her and we have a baby, more of these similar genes are going to be passed on to the next generation. But this might explain why there is a lot of the people would a lot back in the day were against miscegenation, which was having sex with people of a different race. This is why there's taboos against that. But it turns out, I think, that some people think that it's better to have more diversity of genes. So maybe it's not the best strategy to have children with someone who looks like your mother, even though that tends to be people who you're most attracted to. All right, so we're on the topic of psychology, but I wanted to go back to biology again. We were talking about the origins of life. There was an experiment called the Miller-Urey experiment, where scientists put together 4 different things. They put together water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. That's all you need. All they needed. And then with this, they added a spark of electricity, and from this emerged amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and like I said, proteins build things for your body. So this was an attempt to say that life can be generated spontaneously. It doesn't need a creator. But look at what the experiment showed. There needs to be 4 different materials, 4 different things: water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. These chemicals, in order for life to, or in order for amino acids to emerge. Okay. So let's go back to psychology. We have okay, so we have behaviorism. I talked about behaviorism. Behaviorism is also based off of the quadrant. So we have 4 types of operant conditioning. We have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. So the idea behind behaviorism is if you give someone positive reinforcement, he's more likely to do the thing again. If you give him negative reinforcement, what you do is you remove the stimuli that is bad, that is aversive, and then you increase the behavior's frequency. When you do positive punishment, the behavior is followed by a stimulus, such as a loud noise that is negative, and this results in decreasing behavior. And when you have a negative punishment, this is when the behavior is followed by the removal of stimulus, and the result is a decrease in the behavior. So we have the 4 types in operant conditioning, and yeah, so that's essentially operant conditioning. It's based on the quadrant model. We have Piaget, who studied children, and what he noticed, he said that there were 4 stages of development in children. The first stage of development was what was it called again? Let me see. I forget what the name was, so I have to look it up. Hold on. Yeah, the first stage was the sensory motor stage. And in this stage, children tend to be a little bit gullible. They lack what is called object permanence, so they think that if an object disappears, then if it disappears from sight, then it has disappeared, period. So if you cover your face, the child thinks that your face has disappeared. If you cover a ball, the child thinks that the ball has disappeared. He will stop trying to reach for the ball. So remember, the first quadrant is a little bit gullible, believes in supernatural stuff like disappearing of things out of thin air. But Piaget says they're like little scientists. They're always, studying the world. So this, and trying to learn. So this is first quadrant. Fits the first quadrant very well. And we have the pre-operational stage, the second stage. And Piaget says that in this stage, children are not yet logical, right? Third quadrant is when they become logical. But children aren't yet logical, and they like to socialize with each other, but it's kind of funny because when they do socialize, they only talk about themselves. They see things very they don't see things kind of the way that they are exactly. So here's an example. They're not exactly logical thinkers. So if you have a glass of water in a cylinder that is high, and then you have another glass of water. Oh no, you have a glass of water in a cylinder that is high, and then you have a bowl, and you pour the water into the bowl, and you ask which one had more water. The child in the pre-operational stage is going to say, the one with the cylinder that is high, because he can't recognize that the volume of water stays the same, that it's conserved. So second quadrant, not necessarily logical yet. A little bit. Remember, religions are religious people tend to be second quadrant oriented. They are kind of superstitious. They cannot quite discern cause and effect very well. Piaget describes that children in the second stage are kind of superstitious like this. Okay, then once they get into the third stage, the concrete operational stage, then the children, they start to recognize that things are conserved. He calls it, they recognize conservation, decentering, reversibility, seriation, transitivity, classification, eliminate, these types of things. So now they're starting to become logical. But they're also, while they're logical, they're not abstract thinkers yet. They cannot see big general principles, right? The third quadrant, it's more logical, thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. But it also is not abstract yet. It's not intuitive. That's once we get to the fourth quadrant. So then Piaget notes that the next stage of development, and he notices that it's kind of like phase transitions. Once again, these are distinct phases that the child goes through. It's like quantum leaps. All right. So then the last stage he calls the formal operational stage. And this is when children, and it leads to adulthood, are able to see general principles. They're able to think abstract thoughts. So, for instance, they might be able to understand ideas that are not grounded in, well, they might understand things like science fiction. They understand things that aren't necessarily real, abstract things. So one example that I saw of a kid in formal operational stage, she was asked, if everybody in the world was left-handed, then how would the world be different? And the kid said, so this is what a kid in formal operational stage would do. He would start to think abstractly. He'd say, well, everything would be different. The doors would be different. The lawnmowers, most lawnmowers are for right-handed people. The lawnmowers would be for, they would start making lawnmowers for left-handed people. And he went on and on about all these different ways the world would be different. He's thinking abstractly. But a person in the concrete operational stage can't really think that abstractly. Can't think it very abstract at all. So these are distinct stages. These are Piaget stages, and they fit the quadrant model. Then you have a guy like Erik Erikson. Once again, it fits the quadrant model. The first part is, his first stage is trust versus mistrust. The second stage is autonomy versus shame. It's basically the same stuff as Piaget. But then the third stage is purpose versus initiative. Remember, the third is always doing. So this is when kids decides if he has the ability to do things on their own or not. So this is the third stage, doing. Autonomy versus shame, he still hasn't done anything yet. He's just, he hasn't reached the initiative versus guilt stage yet. Then the fourth stage is competence. It's industry versus inferiority. The child starts comparing himself to others, right? The fourth stage always points beyond itself. Now the child is comparing himself to the other children around him, seeing what his worth is, how competent he is. Then we have the fifth stage is fidelity, right? Now we're getting into the second quadrant. So we have the first four stages. Now we're into fidelity, the second quadrant. Fidelity is about relationships. Now we're back into the second quadrant, relationships. We have identity versus role confusion. Then the sixth stage, we have intimacy versus isolation. This is when, this is really the relationship-oriented one. So the second quadrant, it's about intimacy versus isolation, how the person's going to be in his relationships. Then we have generativity versus stagnation. And this is how he's going to pursue his career. So this is the third quadrant of the second quadrant. So we have doing again, generativity versus stagnation. Generativity means doing stuff, generating things. And then he says the eighth stage is ego, integrity versus despair. So it fits the model. He notes that these are distinct stages. Maslow had a hierarchy of needs. The first one he says is physiology. The second one he says is safety. The third one he says is love and belonging. The fourth one he says is esteem. And the fifth one is self-actualization. So the physiology, remember the first quadrant is kind of instinctual type of stuff. He says once you've mastered physiological stuff would be breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, excretion. These are things that you need. But he says once you've mastered physiological needs, then you can move to safety needs. This is security of the body, employment, resources, morality, the family, health, property. Remember, this is second quadrant stuff. Homeostasis, the second quadrant, family-oriented stuff. Then we have love. So he says once you've achieved this, then you can move to love and belonging. This is about friendship, family, and sexual intimacy. Remember, the third quadrant, we start to, it's about more doing things, and we see the sexual intimacy now. Then the fourth quadrant, he says, then we can move to esteem. He says there's self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, and respect by others. So we're having respect of others and by others. Now we're going into a larger context. This is how others perceive us. And then the last one is self-actualization, where you have morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem-solving, lack of prejudice, acceptance of facts. This Maslow thing, it's cool, and it fits the model, but some people question, is this this is humanistic type of stuff, stuff that it might not necessarily be the best model of needs, but it's okay. Now let's go to like parenting types. So parenting types, it's also based on the quadrant model. We have parents who are not demanding and responsive. We have parents who are not responsive and not demanding. We have parents who are responsive and demanding. And we have parents who are not responsive and demanding. I just have to look up the names for these different categories. Oh yeah, I already knew the names. So the responsive, demanding parents are called authoritative parents. Not responsive and demanding parents are called authoritarian parents. Not responsive and not demanding are called neglectful parents. And responsive and not demanding are called indulgent parents. I think that they relate to the personality type, so I would say that a responsive, demanding person would be an NF, the first quadrant, because they're articulate, they like to talk about things, ideas, but also remember, NFs are responsible. They're into, you have to have a job, you have to make yourself needed because they need to be needed. They need to make themselves useful, so they say the same thing needs to happen for the kids that they raise. So they want the kids to be useful, to have jobs, they demand things because they themselves are responsible and they should do that. So people, what I'm getting at is people project themselves onto other people. So if you are a responsible person, you expect other people around you to be responsible, and if they're not, then you think that there's something wrong with them. But if you're not a responsible person, then you see other people, and it's not a big deal if they're not responsible either in a lot of ways. So if you're not responsible, you're not going to make your kids be responsible necessarily. But this isn't true all the way. But anyway, so we have responsive, demanding for NFs. Then we have not responsive and demanding. This is SJs. This is my parents' style. They're not very articulate. The SJs, not to be mean or anything, but they're not necessarily too articulate, or they're not the best thinkers. Not the best ideas necessarily, but they're demanding. So they say, you need to get a job, you need to do this, and you should do this, and you ask why, because they say, because I said so. You just gotta do it, and you ask why. You have questions, and they don't want to talk about ideas. This is the nature of the second quadrant. It tells you to do something and expects it to be done. Just do it. It's bossy. Homeostasis. It wants order. So then we have the third parenting type. I think this would be characteristic of SPs. It's not responsive and not demanding, the neglectful type. Where, SPs, they're just chill. They're just doing their own thing, go with the flow. Just doing their own thing. They don't care about, they're not trying to boss people around. They don't want to be bossed around, that's for sure. And they're not necessarily responsive. They're not that articulate. They don't want to be talking about ideas or, getting into that type of stuff. So they're not responsive. They're not demanding. Then you got the NTs, the indulgent parenting type. This is really the way that I think that if I happen to be a parent, if I was a parent, then this is the type that I think that I probably would be. But the funny thing is people say, oh, indulgent parenting is bad. But it all depends on the kid. So but this is the way that I would want to be parented. So you're responsive and you're not demanding. So you listen to you're responsive, you listen to what the kid has to say, you have ideas, you give them ideas, you talk to them about things, you're articulate, you're responsive. But you're not demanding. So just let the kid be. Let him go with the flow. Don't try to force him to do things. He doesn't need to be forced to do anything. You don't got to try to make him into a valedictorian. Just let him be. The more you do, the more you demand, the more you just mess him up. Just let the kid be. So these are the parenting types. Then you have the attachment types that you see in adults. So once again, we have 4 types. And I'm not just making this stuff up. This has been, this is quote-unquote scientifically based and much quote-unquote research has been done and, to come up with these models. It's silly, but this is what they say, this is scientifically based stuff. And, people's names are attached to this stuff. So this is the attachment model. You have the different types of attachment that you see in adults. It's kind of interesting because this also kind of relates to Plato and Socrates' 4 love styles and, all this stuff, everything relates to everything else. But let's just continue. So we have the person who has a high self-esteem, but he doesn't really care too much about others. Or he doesn't really necessarily want to be around others too much, doesn't care too much about what others think of him. He doesn't really need others, but he has a high self-esteem. Then you have the person who has a low self-esteem and also doesn't really care about others. Then you have the person who has a high self-esteem and cares a lot about others. These are the attachment styles. Psychological factor analysis has been done to differentiate these types, quote unquote. Then you have you do learn this in your psychology classes. I learned this stuff in my psychology classes. So then you have, I was a psychology major at UCSD. So then you have the person who cares about others and who has a low self-esteem. Let me look up the names of each one of these types. I forgot the names. So the person who, so here's the NFs. The NFs they have positive self-esteem, and they also want to be around others. So they have what is called a secure attachment, and this is really true about NFs. Like I said, I like to be around NFs. They make you feel good. Going back to Tupac, remember I said Tupac was an NF? And he really inspired me a ton. I wrote an essay on his work. I really like Tupac a lot. But like I said, he kind of was conservative. Another thing he said was that he felt that he was light-skinned, quote unquote. So there's that kind of desire of NFs to be, kind of white. It's kind of interesting. But okay, so we have what was I talking about? Okay, so high self-esteem, and they care, they have good thoughts about others, positive thoughts about others. This way NFs are, they're very articulate, they're intuitive, so they have this high self-esteem. And when they're talking to others, and they really are helpful. Like I said, is this really altruistic, or do they need to be needed? But I really do think that they just enjoy it. They enjoy helping others. They're healers. They care about others. Then you have the SJs who have a low self-esteem, and they want to be around others. And this is called anxious preoccupied. So this isn't to be mean or anything, but SJs tend to really want to be around others, and they kind of need to have social relationships to feel good about themselves. So they want to tell you about their friends that they have, and I actually love to hear it. I love to talk with SJs about it because I have this aspect of me too. Everybody has these aspects in them. When I feel really bad when I don't belong, and when people, it makes me really upset. But this is the way the SJs are predominantly. They want to please others, but they don't necessarily have a high self-esteem. Then you have the third one, the low self-esteem, and they don't really care too much about, their thoughts about others aren't that high. And this is called fearful avoidant. And these guys would tend to, in relationships, they might, have one night stands more often. SPs are players. SPs are players. They tend to get a lot of girls a lot more, the artisan type. But one night stand oriented, and they're not so much into commitment. Like I said, first quadrant's very into commitment. Second quadrant more into commitment. Third quadrant, we're starting to break. We're more an individual now, the doers. And I see this as low self-esteem. They're not intuitive. They're sensory. They don't, not necessarily super articulate, but they are articulate. And they don't need to make other people happy to feel good about themselves. They do their own thing. They're more spontaneous. I'm gonna do my own thing. Then you have the fourth quadrant, the high self-esteem, and does not really care too much about others. This is an NT's me. I'm an INTP. This definitely characterizes my attachment style. This attachment style is called dismissive avoidant. So the idea is, I have a high self-esteem. I feel pretty good, intuitive. Like, I feel like I can talk to people. I feel good about myself. Sometimes I felt better about myself when I was younger, I feel like, but but you have a high self-esteem, and you don't necessarily need to be around others. So it's true, like and Feynman talked about this. Feynman said that he would pretend like he was busy or that he was incompetent to get people to leave him alone so he could just do his own thing. And I'm kind of the same way. Like, I like to sometimes I just like to be by myself, and I don't want anybody bothering me, and I'm content with that. I'm happy about it. And the NF, he has a high self-esteem, but he wants to be around others. So he kind of has that need to be around others. But I have the high self-esteem. I can be by myself. It's cool. And I don't really feel like I need to make people happy, to be around others too much. But I do actually really enjoy it now. I've become, because it's something that's so important. I'm gonna get into this actually next, why this is so important. But it is true. I tend to, in INTPs, I think this is their attachment style. They're cool just being on their own, and not having people bother them. But not saying that people bother me, but sometimes when I'm just studying my stuff, I want to just concentrate. Because remember, contemplating, passion, flowing, knowing. I want my full concentration on stuff. I don't want to be bothered by others sometimes. So this is that's the fourth attachment style. So going to this though, so what do people need to be healthy? They need sleep, they need food, they need exercise, which I tend to not do anymore, and they need social interaction. For a while after I came up with the theory of everything, the quadrant model, I stayed by myself and I would just stay locked in my room and I wouldn't talk to anybody. And when I would talk to, it's a long story, but it was difficult for a while. And it started to become kind of dangerous. You become unhealthy when you lack social interaction. But, you need these 4 things. The sleep was first quadrant oriented, by yourself, sleeping. Food, food is a social thing, eating. You obviously need food to be healthy. Exercise, this is a third quadrant, doing. And social interaction, it points you to beyond yourself. In order to be healthy, you need to have social interaction. Interestingly, when astronauts go out into space, they need to have either other people with them or they need to bring like plant life with them or some sort of living thing, because if you're just by yourself and there's no other life around you, you go crazy. And then the possible 5th would be meditation. I feel like to be healthy, I need meditation. NFs like to meditate. Prayer could be another word for meditation, but I don't necessarily, meditation, prayer, to me, it's essential. So these are the things that you need to be healthy. See what else I wanted to talk about. So I think we talked enough about psychology. It can go on and on. Everything in psychology is based on the quadrant model as well. For instance, another example, they tried to figure out the factors of personality. They came up with 16 factors. The quadrant, once again, the 4 quadrants within one quadrant makes 16. What else did I want to say, though, about psychology? Was there any? Another thing I want to say about psychology is they've done studies. People can pay attention to 3 things at once very well. So if there's 3 dots moving around on a screen, you can follow those dots even if there's occlusions. So what an occlusion is it's a barrier that blocks the dot so you can't see it going for a second. But then it goes out. So an occlusion would be, here's the dot, and then here's a barrier, and the dot goes through, and then once it hits this thing, you can't see it anymore, but then it goes back out this way. So even if there's occlusions, you can keep your focus on it on 3 dots pretty easy. Once you get to 4 dots, it gets pretty difficult. But you can still do it, but it's very difficult. Once you get to 5, it's impossible. Nobody can do it. You can't focus on more than 4 things at once. Once again, the quadrant model. They've done studies in social psychology where they have groups, and they notice that when there's 3 people together, it's very efficient. When you get 4 people, it's still efficient, but it becomes a little bit, sometimes it can be good, but sometimes it can become a little less efficient. Once you get 5 people in the group, it's not efficient, and there's always somebody who's left out. So they have rules in business and stuff where they try to keep only 4 people at the most in a group. Once again, we have this quadrant model. In the Gospels, in the story of the Gospels, Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I am among them. So he would be the 4th. And it's true. When there's 2 or 3 people, things are very efficient. Things are good. Once you get, right now I'm by myself. I wish my grandma was listening. Then there would be 2 people. And then, then I could talk, and it's more efficient that way. Dialectic is very efficient. But then once you get to 4 people, it's still good. But once you get to 5 people, it's not that good anymore. In cognitive psychology, cognitive psychology is the 4th type of psychology. They discovered that at most somebody can think of 16 squares. So in my head, I can picture in my head 16 squares. Once I get beyond that, I can't keep it in my head anymore. Pretty interesting, huh? We have the quadrant model. Going back to biology, I just wanted to mention a few other things in biology. There's 4 types of tissue in the body. You know, you ask a biologist, why is this? I just say, you know, it's just random. This is the way it is. I also want to mention the embryo after this, but okay, embryo. Let me write that down so I remember, hopefully. But there's 4 types of tissue in the body. There's the connective, the epithelial, the muscular, and the nervous. Connective would be first quadrant, epithelial second, muscular third, nervous would be fourth. Epithelial connects things together. You know, it's the order homeostasis. Muscular, we have the third quadrant, the part that does things. These are muscular tissues. Then you have the nervous tissues, which would be the fourth one, which is kind of different. Epithelial is kind of like connective tissue. So we have the duality, once again, the triad, the quadrad. Okay, so here's another interesting thing. The human embryo has 4 germ layers. Also, I want to say that the period has 4 stages, the period that a woman undergoes. The stages of all this stuff fit the quadrant model. Even the stages of different stages of the embryo, but we're not going to get into those. But the embryo has 4 germ layers. Here's an embryo. I don't know. Okay, we'll just draw it like this. The 4 germ layers. We have the endoderm, the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and then what they call the neural crest. A lot of times people say there's only 3. People don't say this actually. But most people don't realize that there's 4 germ layers. A lot of people think there's only 3 germ layers. The endoderm, the ectoderm, and the mesoderm. A lot of people don't know that the neural crest is another germ layer. But it is. And out of these germ layers, everything in your body is derived. So actually I wrote these in the wrong places. I just looked it up. The ectoderm would be the first quadrant. The endoderm would be the second quadrant. So these 4 germ layers differentiate into all the parts of your body. The ectoderm, your skin, your nails, things like this. Your spinal cord. Oh, I forgot to mention the parts of the spine too. We'll get to that. But yeah, so the ectoderm, that's what it differentiates into. Then your endoderm, your stomach. Remember, this is second quadrant. Your stomach is kind of a second quadrant thing. Homeostasis. So your endoderm, it turns into your stomach. Your auditory tube. Remember, your auditory tube is a second quadrant thing. Your ear. Just the aerosols of your lungs, your urinary bladder. All these things that are responsible for homeostasis. Your thyroid gland and your thymus. I forgot to mention these. Part of your endocrine system, which is very important for homeostasis. This is your endoderm. I forgot to mention that too, so we're hopefully going to get to that. Then you have the mesoderm. The mesoderm turns into your muscles and things like this, your bones. So once again, the third quadrant is the physical part. Your heart, your spleen. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but this is true that there is these 4 layers. So if I make a little mistake, if I say something that is incorrect, it doesn't matter. It's the quadrant model still survives. So this is one thing I want to mention now is if I say something wrong or anything, don't think, oh, well, this indicates that the quadrant model is incorrect. It doesn't indicate that. It just means that I made a mistake. The quadrant model is true. If I make a mistake, I feel bad about that because I'm not representing the quadrant model correctly. But the quadrant model is true. I wish that my grandma was listening so I could have someone to talk to because I like to talk with somebody listening, because if I don't have someone listening, then I go off on tangents. Then we have the neural crest, and this is a fourth germ layer, and the neural crest, interestingly, goes through all of these germ layers, and it becomes, it becomes parts of your body for going everywhere, and it really does move through all these germ layers. So it's separate, but it encompasses all of them. And then your body is formed from these 4 germ layers. Let's look at the spinal cord. This is a fun one. We have the different parts of the spinal cord. I have to find a good diagram. Well, basically, we don't have to get into it too much, but we have the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, and the sacrum vertebrae. And the sacrum is a really tiny part at the bottom. So we have the 4 types again. And some people say that there's a 5th type, the coccyx or whatever. But that's so tiny. Interestingly, the sacrum, the 4th one is the sacrum. I think it comes from the word sacred. And remember, the 4th quadrant is kind of sacred. It's pointing to what comes after it, which is, G. By G, I mean G-O-D, being. Remember, in when Moses sees the bush, God says, I am that I am. Ooh, I shouldn't have said that. Sometimes you're not supposed to say it, but I am and that I am. This guy named Scotus said that what this represents is being. He is being itself. So even the spine represents, fits the quadrant model. Your coccyx is your tailbone, but there's really 4 parts to your spine. Okay, I think that's good for now. Oh, okay, I'm going to continue a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit about sociology, or should I? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about sociology. I'm just going to give... Okay, I'm actually going to stop now, and then we can continue. Hopefully.